All right, welcome to class, everybody. So good to be with you again. So good to see you. This week, we're going to talk about Washington state agencies and sort of a quick primer on what it is that state government actually does, since it's easy for us to sort of lose sight of that. Some of you probably have pretty good knowledge of this. So if nothing else, it'll be a refresher. So back now to our trusty PowerPoint here. Washington state agencies. There's the state capitol. I would predict that the cherries are in bloom right now. So I think the first thing to understand is that while state government spends an awful lot of money, a lot of it's really tied up, and that's what this chart shows us. Now, you probably can't read this at this distance. I would have trouble if I wasn't sitting right in front of it, but as it says on the lower right, 56% of the state budget is required by the state constitution. Most of that is K-12, and with the McCleary decision of a couple of years ago, it would be very difficult to cut spending for K-12 education.
Can anybody tell me how I get some sound?
Oh, Robert can't hear us.
Robert, I don't know how to get Bob. I don't know how to get sound on your computer, but I can't have you keep interrupting TM. So I'm sorry that you're not getting sound, but we're going to have to mute you.
Robert, why don't you go into Doug's office and look over his shoulder and watch that way?
You might want to say that to him in the chat field. Because if he can't hear us, our advice won't matter. The other required parts of the state budget are debt service, contributions to retirement systems, and state hospitals and residential facilities, which are all covered. So education is the single biggest category in the state budget if you exclude federal funds. If you add in federal funds, which is actually about a third of the budget, then it becomes social and health services. But there again, human services, which is this green part here, right there, the problem there is that a lot of those are matching funds from the federal government. So you can't just trim what you spend. If you don't meet the match, you threaten to lose all of your funding. And then you start having to ask questions about who do you like the least, the young, the poor, the disabled, the blind, because those are the people who would be affected. Department of Corrections, prisons, 7 or 8% of the budget, higher education, slightly more than that. So, and then those are the parts at which you could literally decide, well, we're going to spend less. And as I've mentioned before, for higher education over the last couple decades, that's simply been true. 15% of the budget is required by law. That includes bad lighting here in my office. Some medical and some Medicaid. So some healthcare is in there as well. So that's sort of a quick overview of what we do actually spend money on. You will note that the federal government spends very, very little money on education. And that's sort of a common misconception, is that the common schools are funded by the federal government. They're not. And in fact, most of that money goes to federal programs such as free and reduced lunches for low-income kids. So it's enough of the budget to make a difference, but most of the money for K-12 comes from the state, 20% or so from local tax levies, and then the rest from federal and other sources. So the single biggest agency, however, in Washington state government is the Department of Social and Health Services. It used to be bigger. They broke off Children and Family youth services, which we'll talk about later on. But DSHS has more than 16,000 employees working with, as we just noted, one of the biggest chunks of the state budget. They oversee food, cash, and medical assistance, what we used to call welfare, housing assistance, child support, youth services, adult care, mental health and addiction services, support for the disabled, aging and long-term support, behavioral health, aid to children, developmental disabilities, some economic assistance, some rehabilitation. So their budget for the previous biennium, so 2019 to 21, was $13.8 billion. We rank, just in case you were wondering, we rank fairly low nationwide in terms of poverty and the number of citizens receiving some kind of assistance, 37th. On the other hand, the United States ranks 17th out of the world's 19 biggest economies for poverty. So we're not really doing that well. The federal poverty level is $25,750 for a family of 4. And so we're not talking about very much money, and you would be very hard pressed to live in the Seattle area on that income, if even without a family, if you were a single person. Meanwhile, the myth of the welfare mama is largely not true. That was the idea popularized in the Reagan era, that there were women who were just getting pregnant so they could have more babies and stay on public assistance. This has probably happened somewhere, but the only long-term studies done of welfare recipients shows that, look, when people get jobs, they get off welfare. When they lose their jobs, they may get back on. Nonetheless, in 1996, Congress and President Clinton agreed on the Welfare Reform Act, which replaced temporary assistance for needy families with, replaced aid for dependent children with temporary assistance for needy families. The idea was that we were going to force people to go out and get jobs, and the result has been that there's lower caseloads, but there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests that people are simply living without cash. And the other problem is that before, under AFDC, for example, I'd get students who were on welfare and they could go to college and they could get a degree and they could get off welfare. Under TANF, you have to get job training in the least amount of time possible. So, you could do a 6-month training course and learn how to draw blood, but you're not going to make a very good living at that. So I think it's unfortunate that it's not a little more flexible in terms of the training people could get. That's just my opinion. So anyway, even in the Seattle area, Seattle, Bellevue, Tacoma, 9.6% poverty, historically not very good. Only 0.8% of Washington residents get TANF, so there's not like a huge number of people. Including 15,000 adults, 42,000 children, about 16% get food assistance. SNAP used to be food stamps, now they get a card. And the recipients tend to be clustered around the urban areas, Puget Sound, Spokane, Vancouver. The ABD program, Aged, Blind, and Disabled, helps about 24,000 people a month. So Department of Corrections, which we mentioned, is another pretty big agency. They employ 8,500 people. Their budget is about $1 billion a year. They operate the state's prisons and supervise parolees. We have 12 state prisons, including 2 for women, housing around 19,000 inmates and 20,000 people under active community supervision by the department. So I think that's what they call parole now. So they have invested in recent years in trying to train people to have a profession other than crime when they get out of jail. There's some evidence that suggests if you give something they can actually do for a living, they're much more likely to reoffend. The problem, of course, always is enough jobs. They work with the Department of Veterans Affairs, Social and Health Services, Employment Security and the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges to try to improve this. One impact on the state prison system that goes back to 1993, we passed this by initiative, 3 strikes, you're out, which says that basically if you commit 3 felonies, you will go to prison for life. This measure was pushed by the private prison industry, and in many other states, what happened is that enacting this law meant that you had a whole bunch of more people who had to be housed in prisons, and many states turned to for-profit private prisons to take up the slack. Washington did not go in that direction, which I think is to our credit. And it has clearly put some people behind bars for life who don't really need to be there. 288 more lifers for Washington systems, 40% of them African-American versus 4% of the state's population. Their 3 strikes you're out is not a deterrent to crime. Crime rates were falling well before 3 strikes laws took effect. New York did not adopt 3 strikes, and its crime rate fell more than California's, which did adopt. So there's no evidence that this actually makes a difference. In 2019, the legislature removed second-degree burglary from the list of offenses that had reached the 3 strikes threshold. No weapons, not robbing a financial institution such as a bank. And the legislature also overwhelmingly passed a bill that makes it easier for ex-convicts to regain their civil rights, such as voting. So, all right, State Department of Transportation, one of which we all run into or over, manages 18,600 lane miles of roads, 3,300 bridges and other structures, the state ferry system, and those handy WashDOT online cameras that tell you how the freeways and mountain passes are doing. I don't know if you ever use those things, but they're awesome. 6,700 employees, a $9 billion budget, also assists 31 public transportation systems in the state, owns 3 trains that operate in the Amtrak Cascades fleet, and manages the Palouse River and Cooley City rail system, which carries freight in 5 eastern Washington counties. Now, this is an interesting thing. And next month, when we talk about economic development, we may touch on this again, because these rail lines were there. They were abandoned by private lines who didn't feel they could make enough profit to operate them. The state took them over, and they still work, and that helps a lot of farmers get their crops where they need to be. So that's actually quite important. The aviation division, now this was an interesting thing, I thought. The State Department of Transportation Aviation Division runs 16 state airports. I didn't even know these things existed. Most of them are in out-of-the-way locations, from Copalis Beach on the Olympic Peninsula. I was reading, it said, don't land on the light colored sand. I mean, it's just a space on the beach where you could land a plane if you had to. It's wet, you'll sink. To Sullivan Lake in the far northeast corner of the state. Most are better described as runways than in airports, and the runways themselves are likely to either be turf or gravel. Now, on the other hand, Southwest Washington, the Woodland State Airport has grown into a community airport with a paved 2,000-foot lighted runway and amenities within walking distance. Then again, landing is not advised when the level of the nearby Lewis River is higher than the runway. So not a problem you'd run into SeaTac, one hopes. Department also runs Travel Washington, and this was really interesting. So in Greyhound, 2004 opted to cut back a number of their bus routes, only leaving their most profitable routes. The state stepped in 2007, was able to leverage money from Greyhound and the Federal Transit Administration to eventually create 4 new lines. The Apple line, which runs from Ellensburg to Omak, the Dungeness line, which runs from Port Angeles to SeaTac, the Gold line from Spokane Airport to Kettle Falls, and the Grape line from Tri-Cities to Walla Walla. All the lines connect with other modes of transportation, including Greyhound, so that became their incentive to put up some money. They get passengers off of this. Bus lines are operated by private firms, and contracts are awarded by competitive bids. So, and it's apparently it's worked pretty well. They carry more than 31,000 passengers a year, including 16,000 on the Dungeness line. So people are catching the bus to catch a plane. So that's working out pretty well. Department is governed by the Secretary of Transportation, who is appointed by the governor subject to Senate confirmation. Most of the time that happens. There's a transportation commission, a 7-member board also appointed by the governor. So as you probably know, we have the largest ferry system in the country, which moves 24 million passengers and 10 million vehicles a year. 20 terminals and 10 routes linking Pierce, King, Snohomish, Kitsap, Skagit Island, San Juan, and Jefferson counties. There's a story. I don't know if this is true, but I kind of hope that it was. There was a guy trying to get off San Juan Island on a ferry, and he got frustrated and he pulled out of line and said, "To hell with this, I'm taking the bridge." So I'm sure that was a surprise for him eventually. Like everything, the ferry system's not without controversy. People who use it rely on it. People who don't say that it costs too much money. Given our geography, Puget Sound and all these islands, I don't know how we could do without it. There's always been boats moving people around as soon as European Americans came here, and even Native Americans used them too. The reservation system has been a resounding success. Speaking from experience, you no longer have to wait hours in line to get on a boat. You just make a reservation and you get on, and it seems to work pretty well. The ferry system replaced the Mosquito fleet, dozens of privately owned ships that carried freight. There were a couple of private ferry lines. They gave up the ghost in the early 1950s. All that's left of the Mosquito fleet is the Virginia V at the Museum of History and Industry on Lake Union. It does tours. If you haven't been on it, it's beautiful. It's just a beautiful old boat. In any case, now, operating budget of the ferry system is about $220 million a year, 1,800 employees and 22 ferries. It was 23 until the legislature didn't provide funding for a second relief vessel necessary because the boats, despite the department's best efforts, do break down. The legislature in more recent years has put up some money, and of course they just replaced the Mukilteo terminal, which dated from the 1950s. The ferry system tries to get 60 years of service from a boat. Between 2000 and 2010, no new boats were built. Since 2007 have been added and placed in service, one more on the way. One of the arguments is about where should they be built. And at one point we were buying ferries from shipyards in Louisiana, which has all kinds of challenges to it. Least of all, most of all, I think that meant the jobs weren't here. So having them built by Washington State shipyards keeps the money at home. I tend to be in favor of that. Not everyone is. Something to think about. Anyway, system does not quite pay for itself. Fares cost 75%. Fares cover 75% of its costs. Adjusted for inflation, fares are about the same as they were in 1951. So it's a relative bargain. And as I said, the reservation system has been very, very popular. Okay, so here, Washington State Patrol beginning their oath to something. I think they're getting sworn in the state capitol. Another important agency, 2,300 employees, including about 1,100 commissioned officers. I didn't know this. There was a governor's wife way back in the day who decided that all state patrolmen needed to be tall. And I remember as a child student, going down to Olympia for a visit, and there was state patrol there, and they were all enormous. Well, that's why. No longer true, apparently. They do a lot more than write tickets on the freeway. Includes the state fire marshal's office, which provides training, certification, licensing, and inspection services across the state. This includes training for various levels of firefighter certification, such as dealing with hazardous materials, Fire Marshal and the Fire Protection Bureau try to ensure that fire safety is more than a slogan. Fire Training Academy near North Bend provides firefighters with live fire training opportunities. The Prevention Division inspects licensed care facilities, reviews school plans, certifies fire sprinkler systems around the state, and regulates the fireworks industry. So all of that is inside the State Patrol. The patrol inspects commercial vehicles and school buses for safety. A school bus that's been in a collision can't go back into service until it's been cleared by the patrol's inspectors. They enforce size, weight, and load regulations on the state's roads and bridges. In charge of keeping the governor and her or his family safe wherever they are, which came up on January 6th, you may recall. They also patrol the Capitol campus in Olympia. State Patrol crime labs assist law enforcement agencies with forensic investigations, including the toxicology lab, called upon when alcohol or drugs may be involved in a fatality. Criminal Investigation Service collects records such as criminal histories, does background checks, investigates auto thefts, maintains a fingerprint database. Homeland Security Division works on counterterrorism, crime prevention, and emergency management. We provide security to the state ferry system, and they have the largest canine team in the state. Other divisions offer technical services to other law enforcement agencies, maintain 911 services, initiate emergency services when and where they're required, maintain statewide communication networks, and they look for missing persons and try to get them home. So, the Department of Labor and Industries, 2,800 employees dedicated to the health and safety and security of Washington's 2.5 million workers. Let's see, do I have them? Well, I'll be darned. We don't have that slide. Pretend you're looking at a slide about that. Maintaining health and safety standards, workplace inspections. They administer the state's workers' compensation program, which assists people who are injured on the job. So if you call the doctor anymore and say, well, I have an injury, and they'll say, did you do this at work? They attempt to ensure that workers, what they're getting paid. This is something I was not aware of until recently, wage and tip theft. So a lot of people working, say, in various places such as restaurants, basically their bosses collect all their tips and don't give them back. So that's not right. They collected $5.5 million in unpaid wages in 2018. They enforced child labor and building and safety standards. They also inspected 251,000 electrical wiring jobs, nearly 19,000 boilers and pressure vessels, 8,700 elevators and escalators, and registered 5,500 new apprentices statewide. So they're doing a bunch of stuff. Now, here we go, the Department of Ecology, assigned to protect the state's environment, which makes it a paragon to some folks and a pariah to others. Its mission and vision statement sums up the perceived dichotomy in its role. On the one hand, the department says, quote, our innovative partnerships sustain healthy air, land, air, and water in harmony with a strong economy. On the other hand, its mission is protect, preserve, and enhance the environment for current and future generations. Some folks argue that preserving the long-term viability of the environment is in fact good economics. Others only see the short-term costs of complying with regulations. I'm not trying to change your mind here one way or the other. They have air and water quality, shorelines, waste, toxics, and spill. 66% of its budget is pass-through, which means that the money goes to local governments to pay for local environmental projects such as water pollution control, hazardous waste cleanup, stormwater treatment, watershed health, managing solid waste, and recycling. For example, Puget Sound has 5 major oil refineries, and a serious oil spill is estimated that it could cost the state $10 billion and 165,000 jobs. And testing shows that oil spilled in Puget Sound would pretty much just stay there. It's not going to wash out into the ocean and disperse. So it would be a catastrophe. So the department spends a lot of effort trying to prevent spills and maintains a 24-hour response team in 6 locations around the state. Another small but very important agency, the Washington State Department of Agriculture, aims to support the state's $11 billion agricultural sector. It's one of the biggest sectors of our economy. Washington State literally leads the world in the production of a number of products, not apples. The only place that produces more apples than Washington is China, as in the country of China grows more apples than Washington State. So that ought to tell you something. Hops, it used to all come to my mind. A number of things, raspberries, sweet cherries, and we're like number one or number two in the country in about a dozen different commodities. So 300 different things we grow in Washington. About the only thing you can't grow in Washington economically is citrus fruit. Everything else grows here just fine. The department has $151 million annual budget and includes around 750 employees. Apples is the state's top crop, 2.4 billion, followed by 1.2 billion worth of milk and dairy products. Here we go. First in the country for the production of apples, hops, spearmint oil, pea seed, Concord grapes, sweet cherries, pears, raspberries, blueberries, and aquaculture, and is second or third in the country in addition, an additional 12 commodities. Second leading wine producing state in the country after California. Fish and seafood, in a recent year, our biggest agricultural export, 1.2 billion, followed by 756 million worth of frozen French fries. We have 36,000 farms, 95% of which are family owned, and there are at least 100 farms in every county in the state, which I thought was interesting. The legislature and the department have established 21 different commodity commissions covering everything from alfalfa seed to wine. 13 were established by the department director under authority from the legislature, and she or he sits on the boards of all of them. They're all funded by the industries themselves and chiefly engage in product marketing and research. Agriculture department officials attempt to link up Washington farmers with international buyers through variety of programs. Now, there were those fish, and now there are these fish. Fish and wildlife, another important, they have to keep animals alive so more people can harvest them. It's not entirely the case, but in any case, that is one of the things that they do. They are, quote, dedicated to preserving, protecting, and perpetuating the state's fish, wildlife, and ecosystems while providing sustainable fish, wildlife, recreational, commercial opportunities. So they work on preserving habitats and preserving endangered species, enforce fish and shellfish regulations, including co-managing fish stocks along with tribal nations, regulating hunting and educating hunters, issuing license and permits, governed by a 9-member commission appointed by the governor. They set policy for the department and also hire and fire the agency's director, who is in charge of the day-to-day operations of the department. $437 million budget, around 1,500 employees. Now that may sound like a lot of money, but think back, the actual state budget is about 100 billion. So that's really just sort of a drop in the bucket. They track hunting numbers and wildlife populations. They keep track and attempt to save endangered species, from the American white pelican to the Yuma skipper, a small orange moth found only in the western United States. They've had some success. Fishers, a member of the weasel family, have been successfully reintroduced after having been trapped out by 1900. Sea otters were also successfully introduced in 1969, 1970. Otters keep anemones in check, which means they don't overgraze the kelp beds, which is good for everything else in the sea. So some things work, which is always good to find out. Washington State Parks. I think state parks are great, and that's why I included them. Governed by a 7-member commission appointed by the governor to staggered terms. They hire an agency director who oversees the day-to-day stuff. We have 124 state parks, I think the number is actually quite a bit larger than that, but this is the number that I found, ranging from 12,000 acres of Mount Spokane State Park to less than 1 acre for the Ronald McDonald's Grave Site State Park Heritage Site, which is near Curlew State Park in far northeastern Washington near the town of Republic. In case you're wondering, this is not the red-haired guy selling burgers. It is the final resting place of a pioneer in the opening of relations between Washington State and Japan. So parks have both environmental and economic benefits. A 2015 study done for the commission showed that state parks generated $64 million in tax revenues for the state. All the things that people bought because they were going to a state park. That included $1.5 billion in consumer spending and 14,000 jobs. So especially important to rural communities because that's where the parks are. State parks draw 38 million people a year. Parks budget was one of the big losers during the Great Recession when the legislature had to cut billions in spending. Somebody needs to mute there. In its budget in 2017-19 was only 166 million, nearly 70% of which came from user fees, including 13 million in donations from people renewing their driver's licenses. Out of a state budget of nearly 100 billion, as I said, we spend next to nothing on parks. You could close every park in the state, budget wouldn't notice, but people would. They've done a little better in the last budget. We'll see how it goes this time. I don't think they'll get quite slashed again. Apparently, state revenue collections are springing back as the pandemic, God willing, winds down. Parks became a thing when people began to notice that open space was vanishing. Yellowstone was the first national set aside, 1872, Mount Rainier the fourth in 1899. The legislature created the first Parks Board in 1913, but provided no funding or any directions as to what it was supposed to do. 2 properties were donated in 1915, including what is now Larrabee State Park in Whatcom County. The legislature finally got around to providing some authorization in 1921, and soon the park system was on its way, except for the tenure of Republican Governor Roland Hartley, who served from 1925 to 1933. He vetoed every parks bill that came his way. Hartley battled against, quote, waste and extravagance, which in his mind covered an awful lot of territory. The parks were all closed, fell into disrepair. His successor, Clarence Martin, got the parks reopened when he took office. So the first donation to the park system was the John R. Jackson House. This was the homestead of Mr. Jackson near Chehalis. He was one of the first Euro-Americans to settle north of the Columbia River, later served as sheriff, assessor, tax collector, territorial representative, and justice of the peace. It was one of the first places people met to say, hey, we need to be separate from Oregon. Still a state park, and the house was restored by the department in 2017. Now, as promised, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So this got a couple of years ago split off from DSHS, and it was created following a report of a special commission said we need to do something to provide better services to children. And so under Ross Hunter, a former state legislator, they are in fact attempting to do that. Hunter said, look, you know, we're helping the same people with the same problems all the time. Let's do something different. So they have, not nearly as big as DSHS, but fairly successful. They've managed to reduce the number of children in foster care, ended pretty much shipping them out of state. We can run a good system, Hunter said, but don't serve more kids than you need to serve. So now this is interesting. This was created before or after I worked in state government and the Department of Enterprise Services. And what this does is it sort of puts a bunch of things together to make the rest of state government more efficient. It was created in 2011. So 1,100 employees, 185 million budget. and they do printing, fleet services, facilities and leasing, accounting and human resources, risk management, contracting, and managing the Capitol campus in Olympia. So what this does is it gives state government leverage with suppliers. If you had different people in different agencies, say, trying to acquire equipment or cars or anything that they needed, they're not going to get as good a deal as if the state does it as a whole. This is called economies of scale. And so I thought it was just a really good idea. So this saves state government really quite a fair amount of money just by centralizing a number of functions that are going to have to be done anyway. So they've done well. All righty. So that is the really quick version of what state government looks like, at least the largest agencies. There are, of course, hundreds. Most of them are rather tiny. And it doesn't work too badly as far as I can tell. They're still trying to hammer out a budget, and with the usual disagreements, the Democrats have enough votes, so they will be able to do whatever they think they can get away with. So we'll see. Do you have questions about anything? Which will allow me to stop and breathe for a minute. If you have a question, unmute thyself.
I don't have a question, but I do have a statement about the state parks. They also handle the boating program.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they have lots and lots of water. and
Yes.
Lots and lots of fatalities.
Ah,
And that is done by the state parks.
oh, very good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and then there's a number of marine parks, and parks you can basically only get to by boat. So other questions? You're an easy group, but it usually takes you a while to warm up there. Yes, John.
Happened to the motor vehicle testing?
Well, the pollution testing, it went away because we were meeting the target. So we no longer have to do that. I think I had my truck done in December, and the guy said, well, congratulations, you have just had your last emissions test. So yeah, we're apparently doing okay. And how much of that is due to the pandemic, I don't know, but I think it might have been going away anyway before then. So
you said earlier that jails do not reduce crime.
that's not what I said. What I said was that 3 strikes you're out does not appear to be reducing crime.
What is the best feature that reduces crime? And why aren't we using it?
Yeah, good, very good question. One thing that seems to help, as I said, is training people to make a living once they get outside of prison, so that they don't resort to crime and end up back in. That's called recidivism, and that's a problem. I mean, that's really a problem. And of course, you have to train people for jobs that actually exist and at which they can make a living at. There's been a fair amount of success with younger offenders through diversion programs, which get them to do other things. They have to apologize to their victims. They have to make restitution. They go through quite a process. King County has been doing quite a bit of this, and that seems to be having success. So taking young people and doing things with them that convince them, you know what, this isn't going to work out for you. Anecdotally, at least, I have seen evidence, reports on other programs where, for example, in some prisons, they have some prisoners training service dogs, and the evidence there is that because it simply gets people to think about others and gives them a responsibility, those folks end up in jail again a lot less often, simply because they have learned so much from that process. It's sort of like the thing up on my mantle that says, can I be at least half the person that my dog thinks I am? So dogs is good people. So good question. So I think there are some things that work. I don't think there's a single magic bullet, however, but it's just that 3 strikes you're out. It doesn't appear to have actually reduced crime. It certainly has raised prison populations.
So as a follow-up, why aren't we using that technique in our schools, grade schools and even colleges?
Which technique?
Educating the kids, taking responsibilities, the whole thing that is not going on in grade schools right now.
Well, as I don't teach in grade school, I'm not going to presume that they're doing one thing or another. So my dim sense is, yeah, they do try to teach those things. They may not be entirely successful at it, but clearly in some instances, another approach might be needed. I mean, I think it's a complicated problem. What was the program they used to use? DARE? That apparently has no positive impact or another. The kids used to joke that DARE stood for drugs are really excellent. So that ought to tell you how well that worked. But yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, I don't teach at that level. I haven't been in grade school in a long time, and neither have my kids. So it's a complicated problem. I think there's no doubt about that. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Shirley?
Yeah.
I noticed that Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Ecology, I would think that they would be working together quite a bit.
There is actually a lot of working together across state agencies.
Yeah.
So yeah, that does happen. And a friend of mine who once worked for the Department of Transportation, she looked at some of my material and she said, well, the vehicle inspections, multiple agencies are involved in that. So I do think indeed that those 2 agencies do work together as far as I can tell. And of course there's some overlap there.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Yes, John.
What's Good to Go organization that collects.
Oh yeah, the good to go passes.
Yeah.
It's darn handy. I will say that. I don't know how effective it is. It's a not actually uncommon way of managing transportation loads. It's called demand management. So basically, if you raise the cost of using one mode of transportation, fewer people will use it. It also, of course, is going to raise revenue from people who do buy good to go passes. I don't know how many they're selling. I would expect some. I drive out on the freeways as little as possible, but I got one anyway because once in a while, and you don't want to get a ticket for that. So
It seems like the biggest use is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge.
oh, is it? Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. Sure, you've got a lot of traffic going back and forth there. I heard the other day that if they ever get around to extending 509, that the extension will be tolled. So that would probably be a place where the good to go pass would apply, I would think. I suppose that has to happen. I will miss having our own private freeway into Seattle. I will say that. Other questions?
Okay, come up with a question.
Yes.
Did you say that the tips that we give at the restaurants and that, does that always go to the manager?
No, it's not supposed to, right? It's supposed to go to the server or the chef or whoever it is that you tipped, but it's a problem in the industry that some businesses, managers are withholding wages and tips from employees. And so there are laws about that. And so part of Labor and Industries portfolio is following up on those things and getting the money back and making sure it actually gets to the workers. Now, that sounds to me like just horrible management. I mean, how are your employees going to perform for you if they're stealing money? If you're stealing their money, but greed sometimes overcomes people, as we well know just from living here, right? But yeah, they've had some success at combating that.
Thank you.
Yeah. If I've stumped you guys in only 50 minutes, I have failed. All right then. Well, I'm very glad to be with you once again. And next month we will talk about economic development, since that continues to be an important subject. As I explained to my younger students, governments at all level care about economic development because citizens have jobs, they need fewer services, governments collect more money, and they're able to provide the things that people say they want. So, all right then. I will stay here in case you have any other questions. Otherwise, I'm glad to see you. Thank you for being here, and have a good next month.
And thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you, Heinz. You're very welcome. It's my pleasure. All right. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.